Welcome to the National Rural Health Executive Webinar Series. My name is Colleen Bay with NRHA Services Corps. Just a few housekeeping notes to review before we get started. Everyone will be muted. This webinar is going to take us about 45 to 50 minutes to get through, so we'll save some time at the very end for some questions. If you do have a question at any time, go ahead and punch it into your GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll make sure that we address it at the very end. And then as a reminder, today's event is being recorded and you'll get an email before the end of the day with a link to the recording. Today, our presenter is John Gomez. John has a strong background in NIST critical infrastructure and has been involved in cybersecurity and high technology for more than 3 decades. He has lectured and trained on cybersecurity and advanced technology topics worldwide. Before the founding of Sensado, John held executive roles at Allscripts, WebMD, and Microsoft. I'd also like to take this opportunity to say thank you to our partner, Sensado, who has been a partner with us since the spring of 2021. NRHA partners offer not only their vetted rural solutions and services, but they also play a significant role in supporting NRHA's efforts on Capitol Hill, as well as help make our NRHA conferences a reality. NRHA is very selective in what service providers are approved as NRHA partners, and given Sensado's fully managed cybersecurity solutions being designed specifically for critical access hospitals, coupled with today's environment, the alliance made sense. We do consider Sensado and John to be the rural hospital cybersecurity expert. At this time, I'll now turn it over to John for our feature presentation, 10 things rural hospitals can do to reduce cyber liability insurance premiums. John?
Hi, thank you. And just to confirm that you guys can still see my screen, just want to make sure of that because I think we had a little bit of a glitch. Great.
Looks good.
Yeah, cool, thank you. So thank you everybody for taking time out of your day. And hopefully this will be a highly valuable session for you. Really want to talk about a few different things. First is the current cybersecurity liability insurance landscape. And how that is kind of dramatically changing over the period of the last 12 months, and we believe will continue to change over the course of the next 12 months. I know the title is 10 things that you can do. We actually added 2, so we'll look at 12 different things that you may want to consider or think about. This is from the perspective of an insurer, so I guess I should clarify that and I'll get a little more into it. These are the things that we have been learning insurers are looking for as they evaluate you as a potential risk, right? And they write coverage. And depending on what you're doing with these things could increase your premiums or in some cases possibly not allow you to get insurance at all. We're also going to talk a little bit about how to prioritize security investments and reduce insurance premiums. And then kind of talk a little bit about, why we're actually seeing these trends. What is it that's generating all of this? So if you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat window. I'll do my best to answer them. But I hope you get that you walk away from this with a good amount of knowledge and some action steps. I will say that depending on who you are, this is really a topic you absolutely need to bring in your CFO and your CEO and educate them on kind of the material here. Happy to share the slides with you if you want to take your own teams through this. But this topic is catching a lot of people off guard. And as I know many of you are trying to figure out budgets for next year, this is an area that you really want to have some conversations around. So, we had one, and a lot of the impetus behind this has been stories we've been hearing from our own clients. For example, we had a client in the past few months who was paying about $89,000 a year in cyber liability insurance. Now, this client did not have any breaches. They didn't do anything wrong. And they went from an $89,000 annual insurance premium for cyber liability insurance to $539,000. And so the change in that premium, as I mentioned, wasn't because there was a breach. It was simply because the insurers really took a much deeper look at their insured. And some of you may be experiencing that right now. You may be seeing that you're getting a lot more questions, right? I remember over the past several years, the questionnaires that you had to fill out for cyber liability insurance sometimes were a page or 2, and they're very high level. I'm hearing a lot of organizations now that they're getting 5, 10, 12-page documents that they have to fill out. in regards to their insurance, cybersecurity program, rather. In fact, some of the documents that are being requested, or some of the things that are being documents that are being asked to be filled out, are so complicated. We have some of our clients coming to us and saying, hey, can you guys help us, because we're not even sure what some of these things are. And that level of questionnaires, that kind of depth of inspection, if you will, is really kind of driving this higher insurance premium to some level. Because what's happening is insurers are realizing that, hey, not all hospitals have the same level of security. And so they're taking a much deeper and more kind of a pause on how well they're insuring that. We have another client who went from fully insured to fully uninsured in about a period of 6 weeks. And I want to share this with you because I think, again, we're seeing more and more of these situations and hearing more and more of these challenges, especially for smaller to mid-sized hospitals. In this situation, what happened is there was a hospital that was fully insured with a major insurer. That insurer decided to do a kind of a midterm assessment, right, where they came in and said, hey, we need you to, fill out this questionnaire. And it was part of their insurance policy that the insurer could ask throughout the course of the policy period for updates on their risks and what they're doing. So the client did go ahead and fill out that application, returned it to the insurer, and the insurer came back and said, you have an issue here and you need to correct that issue. We're going to give you 6 weeks, and if you don't correct it, we will terminate the policy. And before I get into what that issue is, these are some things that you may want to think about as you're looking at your insurance, whether you already have insurance or you're up for renewal, is get very familiar, or at least suggest that your general counsel or your CFO or COO become very familiar with the policy terms. We're seeing a lot of things in policies that people didn't even realize were in there. And they really never read the policy. They just kind of signed on it. They were really focused on the premium and the payout, but they didn't really look at all the terms and conditions. One of those terms and conditions you may not know is that they can ask you for updates to your risks and to your cybersecurity program, and to reassert and recertify that your program has continued to meet the standards that you said you had when you signed for the policy. The other piece that you need to look at in there is, can they terminate you if your risk profile changes, right? Which is something, again, that in this case happened, right? The risk profile changed for this client, and they terminated the policy. In this case, what occurred was the client had been spending, and this is a smaller hospital, smaller community hospital, spent about the past year or two really getting rid of end-of-life Windows servers. Unfortunately for them, out of about 100, 120 servers they had on premise, I believe about 7 of them, they couldn't upgrade. They couldn't move these servers to the latest Windows operating systems. And that issue caused the insurer to say, well, unfortunately, if you have any end-of-life systems in the organization, we're going to drop your coverage. The challenge that this organization had, and I know it sounds, and I'm preaching to the choir on this, I think ultimately it sounds like, well, why not just upgrade those servers? And as we all know, that's not easy as that is done, right? In this situation, those 7 servers that were end of life, were actually supporting the cath lab and were principal to the cath lab systems. Unfortunately, to upgrade those servers to the latest release and upgrade the cath lab software that could run on the latest release of Windows was about a $750,000 investment that hospital would have to make. And they couldn't just do that. And this is why I think it's really important that this topic, you really have a conversation and call in your C-suite and really even educate the board, right? And get them to understand that this is a much deeper issue. And this sparks a lot of conversations, right? You could be in a situation where, hey, you have to upgrade, for example, the cath lab, and that triggers a $750,000 investment for the organization that probably wasn't being planned for, or we can go without insurance and hope nothing happens. So it's become a very tightrope of a situation for a lot of organizations trying to determine, do they go without insurance and hope for the best? Do they go for insurance and still, if they're doing everything, seeing very high premiums? What do they do? And these, I think, are really critical conversations in terms of the business of cybersecurity day to day within the healthcare organization. So, one of the things that I think we need to talk about is HIPAA. And why is this occurring? Um, so here's the thing, and I think even within healthcare, we have a misunderstanding of HIPAA. And so HIPAA, and I hear this a lot with C-suite, right? When I talk to CEOs or boards and I present to them, and even some of the IT and IT security personnel, kind of what they'll say to me is, well, we're HIPAA compliant. Well, let me just start there. You're really not HIPAA compliant. You follow HIPAA, but there is nobody that's going to come give you a certificate that says you're in compliance with HIPAA. And if we look at HIPAA, right, and we really dive into HIPAA, there's a lot of misconceptions. I mean, I see this every day, right, in terms of what is covered by HIPAA and what's not covered by HIPAA. HIPAA is actually a very small regulation in regards to, if you think about regulations in general, right? It's like 2 or 3 pages, unless we get into all the payment issues and the insurers. But ultimately, the privacy and security rule are pretty simple and straightforward. And for example, they don't tell you how many characters of passwords you have to use. It doesn't tell you have to use multi-factor authentication. It doesn't tell you that you have to have security in depth. It doesn't tell you how you secure systems. It provides some parameters and guidelines. But I think the most important thing to take away from HIPAA is that if you are quote unquote HIPAA compliant or following HIPAA, or you went through some HIPAA security risk assessment, just because you go through those things or you're doing those things does not make you secure. And this is really the foundation of why we're seeing the changes in insurance. And so what happened is about 3 or 4 years ago, when insurers like AIG and Beasley and others got into the cyber liability insurance market, what they saw was, hey, hospitals are really scared of getting hit by ransomware or having some other form of breach. And this is all driven because of requirements to meet HIPAA. And so if we come in with insurance policies, this is a good business for us, right? We can get into this business, insure hospitals, and they'll have a reason to do this just so they can offset the challenge related to HIPAA compliance or following HIPAA. The problem with that was when insurers made those decisions, they didn't really understand the market very deeply. And this may sound like, well, how could they have not? But if you even think about our industry and our understanding of HIPAA, we don't really have the best understanding. We know we're supposed to do it, and we have this false sense of security that if I meet HIPAA, I'm secure. But you're really not. And that's the premise that insurers took. They thought, hey, look, there's this regulation requiring hospitals to be secure. It's called HIPAA. And that regulation requires them to do all kinds of stuff, like have annual risk assessments and other things, right? So this is a good bet for an insurer, right? We've got this industry that's seeing some threats, but yet as an industry, they're really focused on security and they really have it locked down. And that was the problem, because over the past 3 to 4 years, when insurers got into the business and over what's occurred over the past 3 or 4 years, there was this really shocking revelation to insurers, specifically the actuaries within insurance companies. And I guess I should mention this. At the beginning of my career, I worked for a reinsurer in casualty property protection. So I kind of understand the inner workings of insurance companies. And within it, there's actuaries who develop risk profiles or actuarial triangles that predict risk. And when it came to cyber liability insurance and healthcare, those models were off. And what's happened over the past several years is insurers really paid out a ton of money on these insurance policies. And the question came up as an industry, the insurance industry, as to how is it that this industry has HIPAA and yet all these breaches are occurring? Like, how could you have those two things happening, right? How can you be quote unquote HIPAA compliant and yet healthcare is kind of the largest, kind of at mercy of attackers of any industry out there, right? We see ransomware attacks and exfiltrations and all kinds of other things happening all the time. And so that kind of became a revelation that, oh, wow, HIPAA is not really, doesn't really make you secure. So insurers that were insuring based on the premise that HIPAA is security kind of had this rude awakening, right? And they woke up and they realized, hey, if we're going to stay in this business and hopefully recover some of the losses we've had over the past 3 or 4 years on the payout of these insurance claims, we need to really, really take a deep look at a hospital. And we really need to weed out those that are not, really secure. And we need to also increase the premiums of those that we're going to write, but actually represent a larger risk. So it's actually pretty simplistic when you think about it is, why did you guys have really great premiums, right? Because you could get really cyber liability insurance for even very large hospital systems at a really reasonable rate over the last 3 or 4 years. And now suddenly we see this kind of like, wow, I was paying 89,000 last year and now I'm paying $500,000 for the same exact policy, right? Or wow, I'm all of a sudden getting my policy canceled because I've got end of life systems and I've had them for the last 2 or 3 years and yet no big deal. Now all of a sudden it's a big deal. And so I just want to make sure we all understand and kind of what that wake up call was, right? And you'll hear people say, well, it's because there's a lot of attacks or a lot of risk. And yeah, there are a lot of attacks in this industry, but those attacks led to the analysis of, well, why aren't these systems more secure? Why aren't hospitals more secure if they're following HIPAA? And it's really this piece here. And it's kind of sad in a way, right? If we think about it, is because we see this in our own industry, right? Again, I talk to C-suite and boards and others, and I'll hear very often, well, we're HIPAA compliant or we're HIPAA certified or whatever HIPAA X thing you think you are. And yet that when you start explaining to executives like, well, that doesn't mean you're secure, just means you meet a privacy and security rule that's pretty antiquated and really hasn't been upgraded or updated in a very long time and is not very specific as to what you need to do, right? For example, let's just take risk assessments. Like, does HIPAA say that you have to have an external party come in and do a security risk assessment for you? No, it just says you should do a risk assessment on an annual basis. It doesn't say that it has to be done by an external third party. You can very well do your own risk assessments, and that qualifies. In fact, the OCR, Office of Civil Rights, has an entire web page out there that allows you to do a self-assessment using what's known as the HIPAA self-assessment tool. Is that a good practice? No, not a good practice at all. It is definitely not, a way to reduce your insurance premiums and even have, a good security program. But if you follow HIPAA, would you have an issue with HIPAA if you did self-assessments? No, there's no issue there. But that is kind of a good example of how the insurer has assumed that, hey, there's this regulation, and so that means everybody's got to be secure. And it kind of looks at it, if you think about it, part of this also goes back to things like the defense industry, where they use NIST 853, and there's regulations around that, and it's much more comprehensive. So in any case, that's kind of how we got here, why there's a change. But I think this change is important. It's also a lesson for all of us to understand that there's obviously, and I think we all know this, I'm again preaching to the choir, is that ultimately, being HIPAA compliant, quote unquote, is not really mean that you're secure. So, oh, that's a duplicate, sorry. So what are insurers looking for, right? What is it that they're kind of trying to determine whether or not you have or don't have? And what we did is we tried to look at what are the different security protocols, or the different security controls rather, that you really need to think about having in your environment if you really want to either reduce or maintain your insurance premiums or not get canceled. And so these are kind of it. And I'll go through these. I think everybody kind of knows what they are, but this is what's really being looked at. And could these change? Yes. One of the big things I think that is important to understand is, as the threat landscape changes, obviously you need to continue investing in security. And I think this is a good way to kind of take executives through the investments that need to be made in your organization if you intend to have reasonable insurance premiums. So, and I do understand, obviously, for smaller hospitals, critical access and rural, this could be a very serious decision as to, do you even get insurance at all, right? Because you have very tight budgets. This is probably not what you want to be hearing in these times, given all the other challenges that everybody's facing in the financial side of healthcare. And these are significant investments, right? So first and foremost, multi-factor. remote access, and at least your remote access and your admin systems have multi-factor. So do you need to roll out multi-factor across the entire hospital? It's going to depend on your insurer. It is a great practice. It's probably a recommended practice. Can you afford to do that? Maybe, maybe not. Can you come back and say, well, we couldn't get doctors to agree, they didn't want to do this? That's probably not a very defensible position. So multi-factor is really critical and key. Things like managing email. Do you have really robust email filtering and web security system, web firewalls? Not a network firewall, obviously you need that, but actually a web application firewall. Are those things deployed? What are you doing around your backups? There's going to be a lot of scrutiny at your backup systems. Do you follow a 3-2-1 backup strategy? Just having things in the cloud or saying we have a cloud provider for backup is not good enough. There are way too many tactics that attackers are using that allow them to get to cloud-based systems. So if you aren't familiar with 3-2-1 backup strategies, I suggest you Google it. It's not a very complicated approach. It's not very expensive. It's just a way that you maintain copies of your data, including critical data is maintained kind of old school in a lockbox, basically. It's almost going back to the days of tape. Privilege account access management. Are you monitoring for privileged access in your environment? How are you doing things like host intrusion detection and things of those nature? Have you deployed EDR? Big one, patch management, right? And it's really hard to deal with patch management if you don't have the resources. So this is a big one. And there's some creative things you can do here. One of the things we've advised some of our clients who are critical access and rural hospitals is become really good friends with your vocational schools and your high schools. There are a lot of kids who are trying to get a technical background, or they're trying to become better at technology, or they just love technology, whether in a formal program or not. And we found something that really works well is creating internships on a rolling basis, not just during the summer, but throughout a calendar year, where you have kids come in and help with patch management, right? And they can learn to do other things, some other system administration work. They can validate backups. They can review your Active Directory systems to see if you have stale accounts, or they can review log data. And these are cool ways to hopefully do things without having to break the bank, right? Because you can pay a lot less for these resources and provide them exposure to technology and training. And it gives them an opportunity to get real world experience and build up their resumes. And you may even find some people in the community, some kids in the community that may eventually become someone you want to hire. So managing patches and vulnerabilities, things like that, really important, and obviously something that can be challenging if you have limited resources. How are you actually doing incident response? This is a big one. Most incident response programs are not modernized. They're not based on real world latest approaches to incident response. And how are you testing those incident response programs? So that's something else the insurers are going to be very, very interested in. What level of cybersecurity awareness training you're doing. I think this has been addressed for most organizations, but if you are an organization that you're doing like a yearly HIPAA training and you call that security awareness training, that's not going to work for you. You have to have ongoing training. You have to be doing phishing. You should be starting to do vishing at this point in the world. So you need to think about kind of how are you managing and your workforce, how are you doing this security awareness. One thing I'll also mention is how are you helping your IT security teams become familiar with the security tools and best practices. So it's one thing to do security awareness training for end users, but if you're not providing ongoing security training for your IT and IT security teams or staff, and I know some of you that may be 1 or 2 people, that's a challenge, right? That's a risk from an insurer's perspective. And you don't have to send people away to conferences in school. You can use things like Cybery, and a lot of the stuff on Cybery, if you're not familiar with it, are free. So you can do things economically. If you can't do that, you can require people to watch YouTube videos, right? You just got to catalog it. You just got to keep a list of, our IT team on a quarterly basis is required to watch these, watch YouTube videos on ransomware, on security best practices, on zero trust networking, whatever it is, right? So you don't have to break the bank to do this stuff. You could put some of it in place, kind of economically and creatively. Obviously, some of these things you can't. You're going to have to license or bring in third parties. Hardening. Is there something, so there's a good example of something where HIPAA doesn't even talk to it, right? And probably one of the big things that causes a lot of agita for people when you're doing incident response is how are you establishing security baselines? So do you have a master version of all your servers, and that master version has been hardened. So when you duplicate that, whether it's virtual machine or physical, you know that every one of those machines downstream of that master have been hardened. You've shut down ports, you've removed, guest access, you don't have local domain administrator accounts, all those type of things, not just for servers, but also for desktops and other environments. So what are you doing to assure your systems are truly hardened? And then what are you doing to test that? Are you doing internal pen testing? How are you doing that? What's going on with that? And then logging and monitoring, obviously doing things like network intrusion detection, host intrusion detection, log analysis, things of that nature. Are you doing continuous monitoring, and what situational awareness do you have? And this is one we just talked about, end of life. What is your plan for end of life? You may not be able to replace all end of life systems, but you need to be able to at least demonstrate that you have a plan to get rid of them. And it may be over 18, 24, 36 months, but also that you are very clear in terms of how you're securing those end of life systems, right? So for the example I gave you about the cath lab earlier, that client may have been in a better position if they would have been able to demonstrate that the cath lab is isolated, there's no internal traffic that gets to it, there's no external traffic that can get to it, it's got secondary firewalls, there's a secondary DMZ. Maybe there's controls you can put around end-of-life systems, and maybe you can't. But it's something to really think about and try to defend yourself from getting a higher insurance premium, or unfortunately getting your insurance policy dropped. And then things like your vendor and your supply chain. What are the relationships there? What risk analysis are you doing for your third parties? Do third parties have access to your networks? And by access, I don't mean just VPN, RDP, or other forms of access. I mean things as simple as email. If you have a third party who's emailing with your organization, that could be a vector and a concern. And if you don't have email filtering and security tools, that now becomes a bigger risk. And again, if you start thinking about all these things, and you think about HIPAA, it kind of starts to illustrate why insurers had this false perception of what HIPAA does. And even in our own industry, as I mentioned, we kind of have a false perception of what HIPAA does. There's a lot of things on this page that are not HIPAA, but to be secure, you do need to be doing under the current threat landscape, right, and the kinds of attacks we see today and the threat intelligence we see. I think one of the big things to keep in mind here is that this is foundational, right? This doesn't really take the next level of liability insurance and think about, well, how do we protect patients? A lot of this is about protecting the overall network, the overall systems, and our data. But these are kind of the controls that are most important, most foundational to get in place. There's some other things here that you need to do. So those are kind of the basics, right? These controls that we just talked about, right? And I know there's a lot on here, and many of you are like, I don't have the bandwidth to do all this. This is a lot to try to take under. We couldn't afford this. And some of you may be doing, much better with this and further along. I wish I could tell you that these are the only 12 things you have to be concerned about. There are several other things that you need to understand, and that are going to be looked at from an insurer's perspective. The first one is executive intimacy and demonstrable involvement. We're seeing more and more insurers talk to and analyze how intimate are your executives when it comes to cybersecurity policy and procedures. Are they aware of security risks and gaps and threats? And are they tracking them? Are they part of the mitigation process? Are they part of the lessons learned? This is very, similar to other things that go on in the hospital, but unfortunately for decades, executives within hospitals have kind of said, that IT stuff, I don't want to hear about it unless there's a problem. We see that not just in healthcare, but in a lot of industries, right? A lot of people have this phobia of technology. Unfortunately, we're now seeing that this is a challenge if you do this. Executives, C-suite, CMO, CNO, CEO, CFO, board members have to understand what is the current security profile, the current security risk of that hospital. And that has to be understood on an ongoing basis. And we're seeing this not just on the insurance side, we're seeing this also if there's lawsuits. One of the practices we have if we coach attorneys is we tell the attorneys to, hey, you don't need to depose the CIO or the IT team, go depose the CEO, go depose the CNO or the CMO. go depose the board members, because they probably have no clue about the security program, and they're going to look like complete amateurs if they get deposed and have to defend a security program for their hospital. So this executive interest to me is a bigger issue than just insurance. Second thing is frameworks. We see a lot of hospitals, especially smaller ones, that really are just focused on HIPAA, but have no real framework, security framework. HIPAA is not a security framework. So we recommend you do something like NIST CSF. We're not saying you have to go do high trust or NIST 853. We would not recommend that. But getting to NIST CSF and following NIST CSF, if you're not familiar with it, it stands for NIST Cybersecurity Framework, is a really good idea. Version 1.1 or above, and it's free, and you can kind of bring people in if you're not familiar with it to understand how to get there. You don't have to do this overnight. It's something you could do as a 3-year plan. And this is a really good thing for executives to be able to say, hey, as a hospital, we're going to commit to getting to NIST CSF over a period of time. I think that's really a good way to demonstrate executive intimacy and get people on board on security and getting to a common framework that you can report against. And this also works with maturity modeling. We use something called C2M2. It's a very powerful maturity model. Takes a few days to get up and running, and kind of gives you the tools to help everybody get on the same page around where you are. But again, when you're thinking about this from an insurance perspective, insurers are looking for, how are you reporting security risk? How are you identifying gaps in security? How do we as the insurer trust that you really have your hands on the pulse of security on an ongoing basis? Penetration tests, we see this not occur a lot. A lot of smaller hospitals forget about doing them, don't do them, put them off, do them every other year. You need to do at least an internal, external application, wireless, and social pen test. That's a lot. So maybe you can't do all of those in a single year. Think about doing one every year so that you're rotating them, right? If you can't do all of those, at least do an internal and external test. But really need to demonstrate that you are testing systems and that you have the lessons learned and you're addressing those. Policy and procedures, big deal. If you have not reviewed your policy and procedures in quite some time, you need to make sure that they are up to date. We still see organizations, when we come in and do policy and procedure reviews, that have references to AOL or have language in there related to Hayes modems. And frankly, that's kind of scary, right? We haven't had Hayes modems, I don't even, forever, right? I don't even think Hayes is around anymore, and not sure how many people are still using AOL. We talked about risk management, tabletop simulations. It's a good thing to be doing as part of your incident response. These don't have to be really complicated. Would love for you guys to hire us to come in and do it, but you can do these on your own. This is something you can do on your own. If you do it on your own, preserve the material, preserve who attended. They don't have to be crazy. You can do a 30-minute tabletop, but you should have your executives as part of this tabletop, right? And there's some tactics and procedures you can use to come up with some really meaningful tabletops, even if you do them once every 6 months, 30 minutes at a time. If you really want to kind of take to the next level, sure, please look at us or others that do this and bring them in. And maybe you do a tabletop, a quote unquote professional tabletop every other year, something like that. But you need to demonstrate that you are not just testing through pen tests and doing assessments, but you're evaluating your ability to respond to incidents. And then you need some kind of threat intelligence program. You can't really determine or explain that you have a cybersecurity program that is reflective of the current threat landscape if you can't point to what is your threat intelligence. Where are you getting your threat intelligence to make that statement? So a lot of things here, I get it. And I know it's like, whoa, for some of you, this is a lot. But I'm trying to also give you some hints and tips on how maybe you can do some of this more creatively. And reduce cost and do this in a way that's more economically friendly. And obviously, at some point you may have to decide that this is the best we can do given this economic, boundaries that we have as a smaller healthcare organization. And in those situations, you may have to then make the decision that we're just not going to have insurance. I can tell you, in speaking to other hospitals across the country, there's been a lot of talk about trying to come up with a national insurance program, or even speaking to, NRHA, right, around should the association have an insurance program. The problem with this is still what the insurers are facing. And that is, yes, you could come up with an association level insurance program, a self-insurance program, a state level insurance program, and maybe that'll reduce the premiums a little bit. but what it won't do is reduce the requirements of what it will take to get insurance. So let's just explore the fact that if the hospital association did come forward and say, we're going to have an insurance program, they're going to get that underwritten by somebody. And ultimately, that person or that organization is going to say, hey, guess what? You have to have these 12 controls in place and you have to have this other stuff in place. Otherwise, it's not fair to the membership, because if one hospital has really poor security and they continually get breached, every other hospital is going to have to pay for that. So every hospital joining like a self-insured or association-based insurance program will have to have the same level of security adherence. So you kind of can't really get away from this if you're looking to do insurance, whether it's at a state level, federal level, or something else. There still is going to be a minimum requirement to kind of to do this. And there are some models being explored, right? Like something similar to flood insurance, where if you have a federal agency underwrite the flood insurance program. But still, you're going to have some level of baseline. When I talked about maturity modeling, this is kind of what it looks like. You go through and you look at different domains and you really get an understanding of where the organization is for each one of those domains. And then that kind of gets scored and you end up with a dashboard. This dashboard is really what you're looking for to kind of manage quarter to quarter, and be able to demonstrate that, yes, all of our executives, our leadership, our IT team understand where we are and we have a plan to address gaps. And this is critical because then you have a defensible position if you ever need to deal with that from a civil liability perspective. But you also have a way to demonstrate to insurers that, yes, we are very aware of our risks and we are managing those and mitigating them on an ongoing basis. So all of this stuff can get crosswalked, right? You can go from the 12 controls to something like C2M2 to something like CSF, and then that all kind of gets mapped. So this is CSF here. These are the different elements of CSF, and then that kind of can be crosswalked to HIPAA. So this kind of gives you a nice crosswalk strategy if this is something you're looking to do, and a way to track things and get everybody on the same page. One thing I want to talk about, which is probably on the horizon from an insurer perspective, but certainly here today from a civil liability perspective, is that everything we just talked about is data centric. And HIPAA itself is data centric, and so is NIST CSF and NIST 853 and pretty much all security frameworks. And the reason I bring this up, it takes us back to that false sense of security, right? So what we need to understand, and again, this is a conversation where C-suite really needs to kind of be educated on this, and your board, is that, hey, look, if we are HIPAA quote unquote compliant, or even if we do take on NIST CSF and use that as our framework and we deploy C2M2 in a maturity model, and we do all these 12 things that we just talked about, we're really focusing on protecting data. And one of the things that has happened, and I think we've kind of done these presentations with NRHA on this topic, is that you have to keep in mind that that's not really protecting patients. And one of the shifts, the subtle shifts that we've started to see over the past 18 months, I would say, is not just on a cyber liability insurance side, but on the civil liability side. And one of the big things that is coming up, in fact, I just had talks with FDA about this, is the concern for patient safety when it comes to cybersecurity. So you do have to understand that as time goes on, that concern as to whether your cybersecurity program is not just protecting data, but also protecting patients is going to become a bigger and bigger deal. And the reason I bring that up is because the controls we just talked about, or I just talked about, the things I just told you that are being looked for from an insurer's perspective are going to eventually become the foundation for how you address patient safety. So I just wanted to kind of add that in, because I wish I could say to you, hey, just go do all these things and you'll be fine. You will be fine and you will do much better with insurance, but you should also have a conversation amongst yourselves and in your organization around, okay, how do we position ourselves to assure that we can protect patients from a cyber attack and not just protect data? And there's some, it's a whole different conversation. As I said, I think we did a presentation on that topic. If not, we certainly are happy to do one in the future as to what are the subtle differences, or actually more dramatic differences, between protecting data and protecting patients. So that's kind of, I know that's a lot. I don't know if there are questions. I'm happy to go deeper into any of these, but ultimately I wanted to at least give you kind of, hey, how are things changing? the dramatic difference in cost, which I'm sure you're more familiar with than me, and ultimately, so what can you do about it? And unfortunately, I don't have a simple, here's a cheap way to get around this and get some really, really good insurance rates. Unfortunately, insurers are becoming more selective. They have figured out that, hey, they have to kind of dictate what is security and what's a level of security they're willing to insure, and that translates to investments on your side, that ultimately you probably can't get away from unless you don't want to have insurance. But the reason so let me just tie on that a little bit. If you decide you don't want insurance, that's fine, and you can kind of roll the dice on if you get hit or not. But keep in mind, so let's just take the example that your board or your C-suite says, we're just not going to go insurance, we can't afford it. That's fine. And it may be the reality of the situation, you may not be able to afford it. But if a patient gets impacted, patient care gets impacted because of a cyber attack, I can tell you that the place they're going to start looking as to how well your security program was run is pretty much everything I just showed you in this presentation. So even if you don't want or you can't afford insurance, I don't think anybody doesn't want it, it's more of you can't afford it. You need to have the conversation about, well, what happens if a patient gets impacted, patient care gets impacted, patient safety gets impacted from a cyber attack? What's our response to that? How do we protect ourselves? Because that'll be a civil liability suit. So just something to keep in mind. So I don't know if we have questions or not. I'm hoping this was somewhat valuable to you and demystified a few things and gives you some food for thought. As I mentioned, happy to give you guys the slides and obviously have offline conversations if you think it'll help. And I don't, if you guys ever need someone to come in and talk to your C-suite or your board, I'm happy to do that. We don't charge for that. We can do it virtually. So also happy to take them through it, but you can as well, and you can use these slides to do that if it makes sense for you. So questions or feedback or thoughts or
Yeah, John, I have a couple of things that came through. One was just a comment, but I feel like I need to share it. This person had said NIST also has security recommendations for specific things like telehealth. So I thought I would mention that.
Yep.
And then one question I do have is, can you repeat the resource for the cyber training?
Cybery, Cybrary. And just when you go to Cybery, some of it is free, some of it is what do you call it? For fee. So there's that. There's YouTube I mentioned, and I mean, look, we put out a ton of training. If you reach out to me or to NRHA or just email info@sensado.co. We've got like a 6-part cybersecurity series. We've got a medical device security series. All of those are available on demand. They're free. They are not marketing. They are actual training programs. So you could take those and use that as your training, for your teams. So there's definitely a bunch of stuff out there. Other questions?
That is it. I don't have anything else. So thank you so much for putting this together. Thank you to our attendees for joining us today. Before I close out this webinar, John, I know that you just mentioned that you had a bunch of training. Do you want to tell them where they can find that?
Yeah,
website.
Sorry, say that again.
Sensado's website?
Yeah, you can, if you go to Sensado's website or just email us at info@sensado.co, it's probably the easiest.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks again to everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe and healthy. Bye-bye.